So, welcome by this third podcast. Today, yes, as I've said earlier, I want to keep it spontaneous and I don't want to plan too much. So it's really an informal talk about music, about piano playing, about performance, and also in some later stage we're going to be discussing contemporary music and also performing complex pieces, but that'll come later. First of all, today, what should we talk about? Well, I think there are some things we discussed in the last two podcasts and a few things that I've noticed really and I feel need to be discussed because they involve communication. That has got to do with how we communicate with the public. But the first thing is, how do we communicate with our instrument? The instrument, the way we communicate there is so important. We've just got to feel really natural and relaxed and let the music come in the most relaxed way. And the most natural feeling seems to spread quickest to the listener. If you communicate in this way, it seems to work the best. But, well, how do we really make ourselves connected to the instrument? And, of course, every instrument is so different. So we have that first thing. Well, I mentioned indeed in the very first podcasts, I mentioned about how we should try to make our arm the extension of the key. So we really get the feeling that the keys are balanced in our fingers and that we actually are really a connection with that. When we do it this way, if we curve our fingers too much, we make the key is taught so far and then we have a different thing here. So we have two different areas. And that means the connection is not completely right through. When we just make our fingers a little bit, just like when we're walking and you may feel your fingers loose and you put them down, they come around about that sort of curve. And I call it the sort of diagonal touch. Okay, so then you feel that, but you feel it actually mainly on the tips of the finger. And this is something I've discovered very often. Many very good pianists and young people don't seem to really have got the connection between the finger top, that part of the finger, not the very top part of the finger, but the cushion of the finger. And that way you really feel actually your instrument. And this is one of the things. The next thing that I think is important is that when practicing, I've discovered for myself, but also for many other people also, that it helps very often to let the finger return with the key. So the key does the work, not the finger. The finger just comes back because the key wants to return. Actually, this is basically the technique that Ferruccio Busoni used. It was one of his techniques. And he used that, and that was one of the ideas of Busoni, was something which has not originated with Busoni, because I think that is very much earlier also the case. It is a sort of non-legato, portato-like practicing. So you would actually practice things something like that, without any pedal, and you would practice it in that way, and that somehow gives you the possibility to feel the shape of the music. And you see something else. What I'm also doing is, with the long note, that small movement A very small movement. See, so it's almost as though there comes a crescendo in the long note. In fact, sometimes it does. I think it should. I think the long notes should actually, although we know when we just play like that, the note just goes down. But if we play like this, it somehow does something else. There's some sort of resonance that comes out of the note if you play it in the right way. And the long notes somehow give us the real feeling of connection with the piece and also certainly with our instrument, because we listen differently. That's another area. We will certainly talk about that sometime, about how we listen to our playing and how we actually listen to music generally. But that's another discussion. But getting onto the subject of this I think is very important. So there's several things. The first thing is the form of the hand, somehow that it's connected to the key so that the actual arm is an extension of the key. Vladimir Parkman, the great old pianist, he had a theory about playing. He even went a step further. He said that the fingers should have some direct connection to the elbow. So that means there should be one line right through to the elbow. And that means then that the key is absolutely a complete extension right through. So it's something to be considered, and sometimes it certainly helps to get a better sound. And even on a bad piano. In fact, that's another thing. You know, there are of course no bad pianos, there are only bad pianists. Basically, that's the unfortunate story. But on the other hand, sometimes you might discover that you give your best recital, your best performances on a bad piano. So it doesn't really need to be always so perfect. In fact, Franz Liszt once said that every piano has its own character, and it's more important to find the character of the piano than to say that it's a bad piano. Well, just something to think about. Next thing was, of course, the releasing of the key. The key itself comes up and releases the finger. This is very good for all fast passages. That you really get quite a precision. It should be very precise, but not too precise. But in that area. I think that those things are just important. And that's just a few of the things that we discussed a little bit about in the first two podcasts, but maybe not so clearly as now. Anyway, that's just a thought. One of the things that I miss always in performances, almost always, even in my own performances I've missed them, is that some composers, no, all composers, have moments that are possibly could be considered better than other moments. And the funny thing is that these passages, if you play them all very metronomically, very, very, very strict with a metronome almost, you just don't seem to hear those wonderful passages. They seem to go unnoticed. And I've often thought that some things in a symphony or even a sonata, some passages are really brilliant and beautifully done. And somehow there are passages around them that maybe don't need to be so brilliant. They can actually even be a little bit, well, I would say the word boring. I don't really like the word, but let's say the word boring. They're a little less important. And this goes a little bit back to Gustav Mahler, who I think really had in his conducting a great feeling for what was important in a composition and what wasn't important in a composition. And what I've understood from his conducting he played mostly the wonderful passages that were to be found a little bit slower, a fraction slower, broader than the passages that were not so important. And I think that in this way you get an enormous wave feeling, a real feeling of freedom and wonderful development. This is interesting. I found it very interesting because I've been working very much, or looking at very much, at the Beethoven symphonies that have been transcribed by Franz Liszt. I think they're wonderful transcriptions, really great transcriptions. And some passages in them are absolutely amazing. I can play you a few. For instance, one of the pieces, well, starting with the third concerto, third symphony, you get this. I'll show you what I mean. We have it goes on at a certain point like this. And you get this. Just a quick example. Just those passages, those modulation moments, taking a little bit more time. What I'm doing now is demonstrating it a little bit extreme. I wouldn't do it so much. I would probably like to hear it with an orchestra played like this. Something like that. The wonderful thing is, it can be different every time. And just in that area, so that you get this freedom of feeling. This really would go at a certain point, and then there's a wonderful little passage here, which demonstrates a few things I've been talking about. For instance, we have this. Movement of the arm, that sort of thing really somehow is something I think which needs developing. One of my favorite passages in this symphony is very simple. Just listen to it. It's just this passage here. Just a simple passage, but it's a wonderful thing. How he does that, this going there, this wonderful, and this one here, and then it here. And so on. Well, I like it. Then another passage which I think is very important, and you hardly ever hear this well done. And this one here, and it here. Not much happens, but actually a lot is happening. because of the modulations and because of that surprising effect. One of the main things in every piece of music is, of course, actually preparation, the actual thinking something's going to come, something's going to happen. And I think that's one of the things I often feel is wonderful in music. You have here, at a certain point, this happens in this first movement of this symphony. And here, these notes here. And then later you get this. Here, those lines, wonderful lines coming out in this piece. My question is, how often do we hear it? Unfortunately, I don't think that is very often the case. Anyway, just a few points that I would like to make. Then it's just one last demonstration, and that's this passage here. I love this. You get this chords here. And then you get this. Just some wonderful moments, wonderful things are happening. Okay. Well, you know, I could play more and more of these things. There's one or two things that I think also need to be thought. The climax, for instance, here, you get this. Also a fantastic passage. So there are some wonderful moments. And what do you think about this wonderful moment that even Beethoven wrote about, because his horn player, everyone thought his horn player had come in too early. What about this moment here? Just a wonderful thing. It could be contemporary music almost. Just incredible, just amazing. Can you imagine listening to that 200 years ago? How that must have come, how that must have worked. I'm sure that when Beethoven was conducting, he would have been conducting in a rather free way. I don't think it was at all metronomic. And what I've read about his conducting, it certainly wasn't. So I think we can assume that something of this idea may have been the case in those days. What I think is wonderful when playing these incredible transcriptions, don't forget Beethoven was a great pianist in his own way, very much an improviser. And he was improvising the Fantasia, Opus 77, a wonderful, wonderful improvisation. And possibly how he actually sounded when he was improvising. And I think that when he wrote his pieces, he might have felt them more as piano pieces in the beginning. Even the writing, like what I've been demonstrating, some of it is so well suited for the piano. It's amazing how good that sounds. There's another symphony of his, of course, of all of the 9 symphonies. This one, I love the slow movement of the second symphony. Here. When you start, you can hardly ever stop. So that is something I wanted to mention about one of the things that I think we miss a little bit in performance. And I'm not criticizing anyone in particular, because I think it's just a general tendency we have. And that's probably because of the following reason. And it's one of the things that I must say, and I want to talk about that in one of these podcasts, is my interest in legendary pianists. And I mean pianists from the beginning of the last century until around about, well, maybe the 1970 or something about that period. The whole period, many, many great pianists in those periods. And what do I mean by this? Well, today we have so many recordings and so many possibilities to just listen to different interpretations. And I think that without realizing it, we are very quickly influenced by them. And the main problem, I think, is that the most interpretations actually that we listen to are from around about the years 1960, 70 to now. And they are all a little bit the same. That's exactly the problem. And I think the wonderful thing about the early performances on record is that these people recording in those days, they had no possibility to compare it to many other people. And as a result of that, they had their own individual idea. And sometimes maybe an idea that was very close to the original idea of the composer. And that's why I mentioned earlier these Beethoven symphonies in the transcription from Franz Liszt. I believe that he had a very strong idea how they should actually be performed. And I think he's worked it in the way he's done his transcriptions, a little bit like what Ferruccio Busoni did, because when Ferruccio Busoni was transcribing the organ works of Bach, what he did was not only transcribing the notes were of course the basic thing, but he was also transcribing the acoustic in a great cathedral, the acoustic of an organ. And that's something a little bit more than just writing down the notes that we see in the score. And of course, we mustn't forget that many composers, when they perform their own pieces, they never played them completely the same way that they were written down. So that's my experience with a lot of composers also, but I'll talk about that in some other podcast. I would like to talk later about Sarabji, about Xenakis, and about Krenek, and a few other great composers of the century, and what I've discovered from them, and what my thoughts have been about performing these pieces. There are some other very important areas I want to discuss in the future podcasts, and that's contemporary music today. And one of these things is one of my dear friends and one of my, the person that even makes these podcasts possible is Maurice Verheul. And he should certainly be one of the people represented in a future podcast. We will do that, and I'm looking forward to that. So thank you very much for listening.